5 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Let's get you set up for the day. Stock futures are lower, Treasuries higher as traders return from a long weekend. We're looking ahead to December inflation data later this week after last Friday's January PCI. Round two, Iran and the US set for nuclear talks in Geneva with Oman as the mediator. And Anthropic and the Pentagon hit a snag in contract discussions over mass surveillance and security concerns. All that coming up the next hour, but let's take a look at these markets because, of course, it's a holiday-shortened week here in the United States. There was no trading for equities or treasuries, obviously, yesterday for President's Day. And we did see that rally fizzle out on Friday after that more benign CPI data on Friday. That has futures pointed lower. Even Russell 2000 futures are lower today. In fact, small caps may test their 50-day moving average today if we continue on this track. But it's particularly in NASDAQ 100 futures where we're seeing the decline. Also seeing a big move in treasuries. So we had that big move on Friday, and that is continuing today with the 10-year yield down another 2 basis points. That is a massive move just in the last 2 weeks. Traders pulling forward bets for Fed rate cuts and maybe even adding in a third this year. That 30-year yield at 4.66 and the 2-year yield all the way down to 3.39. We're going to be speaking about all of the market moves and whether that might all change this week in just a few moments. But first, let's get to some individual market movers this Tuesday morning. Over to London and Abir Abu Omar.
Good morning, Bonnie. Let me start with some M&A action for you this morning, starting with Zim Shipping, which was up a whopping 40% this morning on the back of some, as I mentioned, M&A news. Hapag-Lloyd offered $35 a share for Zim, and it's going up this morning in the pre-market. That values the company at around $4.2 billion. And this is a space that struggled quite a bit since the post-COVID days because of freight rates that have gone lower. But moving on, staying in the same space, but moving on to another company that is doing quite well this morning. Norwegian Cruise is up this morning, and this is on the back of activist investor Elliott taking a stake that is over 10% in the company. This is another stock that hasn't done well in recent years, so Elliott wants to help it with this underperformance. And then finally, Paramount, Vonnie, it's gone up this morning 3%. It's paired some of those gains, but still up quite a bit, and this is on the back of renewed talks with Warner Brothers. We reported over the weekend that Warner Brothers might be interested in coming back to the table with Paramount, and this is on the back of an amended deal that Paramount has given Warner Brothers. So this could bring a renewed push to the bidding war with Netflix. We'll keep an eye on this space, Bonnie.
Yeah. There could be a second round. How exciting. Abir, thank you so much. It's all deals action today. Coming up later in the hour, Marvin Lowe of State Street saying it's rotate America, not sell America these days. He's joining at 5:30 a.m. Eastern. But first, Islamic Republic of Iran broadcasting company Khan reporting that nuclear talks between Iran and the US have begun in Geneva in the last hour. Take a listen to President Trump yesterday.
So I'll be involved in those talks indirectly, and they'll be very important, and we'll see what can happen. I mean, it's been typically, Iran's a very tough negotiator. I think they want to make a deal. I don't think they want the consequences of not making a deal. They want to make a deal.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Onur Ant. And we know, Onur, that we also are seeing the Foreign Minister Aragachi speaking with the head of the IAEA before these talks. Do we know anything about how that IAEA conversation will have gone?
That's the conversation where Iranian Foreign Minister Aragachi relayed their proposals to the IAEA, which has been pushing for a resumption of visits to nuclear sites in Iran that were bombed by the US and Israel back in June during the 12th-day war. We know that those are the proposals that Iran will be delivering to the US as part of the negotiations today that are taking place in Geneva with the mediation of Oman. Now, the key thing to note here is that we have seen that although Iran has long maintained that nuclear enrichment on its soil is an inviolable right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which it is a signatory, it has also signaled some flexibility around that red line, and it has tied the whole negotiation over the nuclear enrichment activities to the potential lifting of U.S. sanctions during the Geneva talks. So that's going to be the thrust, the gist of the talks today taking place between the two sides, Vonnie.
Yeah, and we know that the oil market is watching this because it's binary, right? It could go either of two ways. We could start getting more supply if sanctions are eased, or less supply if there are disruptions, Onur.
That's correct, and we have seen that already yesterday when oil prices, after posting their first weekly decline since the beginning of the year, suddenly jumped on the news that Iranian Revolutionary Guards were holding military drills in the Strait of Hormuz. And I should remind you that the drills itself, although they do take place every now and again, what was new about the drills was the fact that the Revolutionary Guards sort of surrounded those drills with a very specific language that was referencing possible potential threats coming to the Islamic Republic from the Strait of Hormuz, and how they were ready to deliver a decisive blow to any threat coming from the area. So yes, Iran is signaling that, yes, it is ready to negotiate with the U.S., which it is already doing, but it is also ready to respond to any military confrontation should the talks in Geneva and later possibly elsewhere fail to yield a compromise between the two parties.
Yeah, I mean, we've just had a statement from Khamenei just literally 4 minutes ago to President Trump: you won't be able to destroy Iran. So it's interesting to see the two tracks at the same time. We're also seeing the beginning of 2 days of further talks now, U.S. mediated, on Ukraine, Russia. Onur, any hope that there'll be a breakthrough there?
Well, the talks there are equally tricky. Obviously, there are still huge differences between the two sides. We have seen that Zelensky coming under pressure, especially from the U.S., to possibly consider concessions to basically bring Russia to a peace deal. And we have also reported in the last few weeks that U.S. is somewhat operating on an expedited timeline, given the midterm elections in the U.S. But yes, the gap there also remains very, very wide, and it remains to be seen how that could be bridged, Vonnie.
Onur Ant, Managing Director for Middle East and North Africa, thank you so much for joining us today. Turning to tech now, Anthropic in talks with the Pentagon, but hitting a snag. The AI company wanting to put guardrails in place to stop its Claude tool from being used for mass surveillance and for developing weapons. Joining us now is Tom McKenzie, host of Bloomberg Tech Europe. Tom, are these negotiations with the government, or can the government just direct the company to do as it says?
Well, at the moment, they're negotiations. As far as we understand, Anthropic has had and is coming up to the end of a 2-year contract with the government where it's provided models that have helped to pull in data, particularly in terms of the national security data, intelligence, and to make sense of that for the government. Then they're coming to the end of that contract, and the negotiation seems pretty fraught because they're trying to put a guardrail around this technology to stop it being used for, as you say, the mass surveillance of Americans or for the use of build-out of autonomous weapons systems. The Pentagon seems to be pushing back pretty hard. They say they want to be able to use this capacity, this AI model provided by Anthropic, for everything as long as it is legal. And we're hearing from some defense officials briefing Bloomberg, suggesting that some within the Pentagon, some within the Department of War, see Anthropic now as a supply chain risk and may even consider talking to vendors to the Pentagon and getting to confirm that they do not use Anthropic. So the stakes are pretty high for Anthropic, and it potentially opens the door for OpenAI, for Gemini of Google, for Grok of xAI, potentially to get a piece of the action. They are all working on systems, on models that would be compliant and would fit into and bed into legally into the Pentagon's workflow. They're not there yet, but it potentially opens the door to that. So we'll continue to watch these negotiations, and it also points to two key things. One, militaries around the world, including the US, are leaning very heavily into AI software and AI hardware embedded, and the ethical dilemmas now for companies and large language models and labs that still maintain that the build out of AI and the move towards artificial intelligence are about benefiting humanity. So the ethical concerns will become more acute. And what we see in terms of on the battlefield, how AI changes both the hardware and the software, that will also continue to be in focus.
And Tom, as I understand it, Anthropic already had built Claude Gov specifically for this purpose, right, to offer to the US government as a tool.
Yeah.
Are we to understand that perhaps that didn't go far enough, that it doesn't allow the government do as much as the government wants?
Well, I think that's the interpretation, isn't it? I mean, again, according to reporting actually officials have been really pleased and really impressed with the Claude Gov model that they've had access to in terms of pulling together intelligence data, making sense of it, and allowing them to make smarter and quicker decisions. And it seems that that has been something that's been welcomed broadly, but this is a Ministry of War, Defense Department of War, and a Pentagon under Pete Hegseth that wants to have more utility, that wants to be able to push the boundaries in terms of what they can use this tech for. And this happening at the same time as there are reports that SpaceX, owned of course by Elon Musk, is looking to take part in a competition at the Pentagon to build out voice-activated autonomous drone swarms. So again, the Pentagon is leaning into this. They see this as really important in terms of how they fend off their adversaries and having the tools at their disposal to be able to contend with their adversaries. And this is leading to this point of contention.
Tom McKenzie, thank you so much. Tom McKenzie, host of Bloomberg Tech Europe, among other programs on Bloomberg. And we're going to continue talking about what Tom just mentioned, because SpaceX and xAI are competing in a secretive new contest to produce autonomous drone swarming technology. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Lauren Grosh. Lauren, as I understand it, this is sort of next-gen drone autonomy, right? So we have drone autonomy, but this would be voice-controlled swarming drones capable of coordinating multiple unmanned systems at the same time. Am I reading that right?
Yes, as my colleague Katrina expertly reported, the idea is translating voice commands to swarming drones in pursuit of a target over air and over the ocean. And apparently that is still a challenge, and so the Pentagon is hoping to compete this kind of software technology using AI, and SpaceX and xAI, the newly formed company, seem to be part of that competition.
Who is close to having this technology? As I understand it, just regular drone technology-wise, we are seeing a lot of companies supply that to the Pentagon, right? And not just the majors, but also some smaller independent companies and so on. Are they all in the race for this drone swarming technology?
I'm not exactly sure, but I know that Katrina also did report that OpenAI is part of this competition as well. So I imagine that many AI companies are going to want a piece of this pie in some capacity.
All right, and they operate separately, SpaceX and xAI still, even though we know that they're very likely to combine. How might they work together in the future?
Sure. So as we understand it, when we reported that SpaceX acquired xAI, it is a wholly owned subsidiary, and they are operating largely separately. That has a lot to do with the fact that SpaceX is subject to something called ITAR, International Traffic and Arms Regulations, whereas xAI employees are not cleared for those regulations. And so they want to remain largely separate. But I think this is a clear sign of how the companies could be working together moving forward. Also, there are obvious ways that they are going to work together. For instance, one of the main reasons for this merger is that Elon Musk has this grand vision of putting data centers into space to do complex computing for AI. So obviously, SpaceX would be serving that, xAI would be the customer for SpaceX. And then, as we also understand, SpaceX employees have been using a specialized version of Grok into their workflow. So there is going to be some crossover moving forward.
All right, Lauren, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Lauren Rush. Earning two other top stories trending on the terminal now this morning. Danaher nearing a roughly $10 billion deal to acquire U.S. medical technology firm Masimo. That according to the Financial Times. The deal would value Masimo at a premium to its almost $7 billion market capitalization. Danaher develops and sells products used in biotechnology, life sciences and diagnostics. BHP shares jumping to records after posting earnings at the upper end of analyst expectations. Copper accounted for more than half of BHP's profit. Bloomberg TV spoke with BHP Group Chief Financial Officer Vandita Pant.
For the first time, 50%, more than just about 50% of our earnings, EBITDA, came from copper, and performance across our assets has been very good. To take example of Escondida, which is our largest mine that we run in Chile, we are revising the guidance up for this year and next year, which means that we will be producing more copper in the constructive copper price environment that we are in.
And Goldman Sachs is planning to remove the diversity criteria in identifying potential board candidates, according to the Wall Street Journal. The bank's board is expected to approve changes this month. The move in line with similar rollbacks by peers, including Citigroup and Bank of America. Coming up, we head over to the United Kingdom. Sterling weakening against the dollar as unemployment hits a 5-year high. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
The Bank of England in February, they kept the door open to a March cut. I think today's data reinforces our base case that they will go in March. But does this mean that they need to go back to back or they need to go very aggressively? In my opinion, the data has not weakened enough yet for us to make that conclusion.
The unemployment rate in the UK hitting its highest since the pandemic. That's cementing traders' bet on 2 interest rate cuts this year by the Bank of England. For more, let's bring in Marvin in London. So as the commentator there was saying, Marvin, this very likely cements a cut next month, but will there need to be back-to-back cuts, particularly since we're seeing inflation coming down? It was 3.4%, it's now at 3%.
Well, yes, it does solidify those bets for an interest rate reduction. It really follows with what the Bank of England have been suggesting that they wanted to do. They've been looking for further evidence of inflation cooling. We'll get more of that from CPI tomorrow. But this does indicate that wage pressure has been easing more than expected. And that really sort of clears the path. And that's the way that the market has responded, now fully pricing in a rate cut for April and also moving towards it being more than sort of 70% likely in March, with a second cut fully priced in for November.
Yeah, and they do get more data before the April meeting as well. Now, more troubling perhaps is that the unemployment rate for males aged 18 to 24 is at 17%. That is a massive figure. And, you know, there's only so much central banks can do for particular demographics, right? But is there anything they can do to target the weaker segments of, you know, what's in this data?
I think that's an interesting question. What we're seeing is sort of private sector wage growth. That slowdown has been coming, which is what we really need to see. I think the public sector side of things, they might be able to look through that as being the sort of one-off due to pay rises that are sort of known about. I think what's interesting when we've just seen some productivity growth data coming through is that you're seeing productivity increasing a lot in IT, perhaps with the AI impact there, but in other areas it is decreasing, and overall there's been a productivity decrease according to the labour forces survey data that the ONS currently use, and that is quite concerning, I think, for young people, especially as we do see unemployment rising slightly more than economists had expected.
We saw quite the move in sterling, Marvin, and gilts as well, moving off the back of this. Were markets not anticipating such weakness?
I think it was a bit of a surprise, actually. We had expected wage increases to slow, but not by as much, not to sort of 4.2% instead of 4.6%. That was quite a surprise. We saw sterling fall quite sharply when the number came out. It's come back a little bit now, but still, you know, falling below 136. And also, particularly in gilts, seeing yields coming down as those traders adjusted their bets, particularly at the lower end of the curve. But that's something we've seen across the curve and outperforming Europe today as well in terms of the gilt market. So that's certainly good news for mortgage borrowers, but also for the Treasury as they look to hold on to or increase their fiscal headroom ahead of next month's spring statement.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll see if those inflation figures tomorrow do come in at around 3%, as consensus is expecting in January, down from 3.4% in December. Marvin, thank you so much. Coming up, Hyatt Hotels chairman, well, he's stepping down over Jeffrey Epstein ties. More on that story and look at what else is making headlines in your front page news next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Time now for your front page news. First up, the Wall Street Journal reporting activist Elliott has built a more than 10% stake in Norwegian Cruise Line, making it one of Norwegian's top investors. The company has lagged competitors including Royal Caribbean and Carnival. Norwegian shares among the worst performing in the S&P 500 over the past 5 years, with the stock remaining near COVID-era levels. Next up, the Financial Times reporting hotel magnate Thomas Pritzker has stepped down as executive chair at Hyatt, the hotel group founded by his father. This after documents revealed the extent of his ties with sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The documents revealed extensive email correspondence and references to meetings spanning more than a decade to 2019. Pritzker said in a statement he exercised terrible judgment in maintaining contact with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And finally, the New York Times reporting Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is calling on 2028 Olympics chair Casey Wasserman to resign. This after his name surfaced in the Epstein files. The mayor told CNN she cannot fire him, noting only the non-profit board of directors can replace him. Wasserman helped craft the winning bid for the Games, but announced last week he's selling his entertainment agency because his limited interactions, as he put it, with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell 2 decades ago had become a distraction. Those are your front page stories. Let's take a look at the market setup now going into this Tuesday post the long holiday weekend. Futures lower, yields lower, and the Bloomberg Dollar Index unchanged. Coming up, Marvin Lowe of State Street. It's 5:30 a.m. in New York City. Good morning, I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Let's get you set up for the day. Stock futures pointed lower, Treasuries higher as traders return from a long weekend. We're looking ahead to December PCE data later this week after January's CPI data was benign Friday. Round 2, Iran and the US set for nuclear talks in Geneva, Oman mediating again. And Anthropic and the Pentagon hitting a snag in contract discussions over mass surveillance and security concerns. So let's take a look at those markets now because we are coming off that long weekend. You can see futures pointed lower, particularly Nasdaq 100 futures indicating that tech sell-off might continue. We did see a rally in equities, but it fizzled out on Friday. This, of course, as we saw a major move in Treasuries as well. Let's take a look at where they stand because that move continues. We have the 10-year yield now under 403, the 2-year yield under 340, and the 30-year yield at 467. It's a pretty amazing move. Traders pricing in perhaps a sooner Fed cut and maybe even a third Fed cut this year. Still have a few stragglers in terms of earnings. Palo Alto Networks reporting after the bell, for example. It's currently in the long part of the Goldman Sachs AI proof basket. We'll see if that proves to be a good play. But let's get some individual movers before the market open now. And Abir Abu Omar.
Hey, Vonnie. Let's start with some consolidation in the shipping space this morning, starting with ZIM that is up 35%, almost 35% this morning. This is on the back of Hapag-Lloyd, the German counterpart, offering $35 a share. That values the company at around $4.2 billion, and investors are clearly looking favorably at this morning. Moving forward to, and staying in the same lane, to Norwegian Cruise that is also up this morning. This is on the back of a Wall Street Journal report. The Wall Street Journal are reporting, citing some of their sources, that activist investor Elliott is interested in taking a stake of over 10% in the company that's struggling quite a bit. They've already put in a board member, or suggested to put in a board member in Norwegian Cruise, and this is why the stock is acting favorably again this morning, up 11%, adding on those gains from the morning. And then finally, Paramount, Vonnie, that is up this morning slightly a little bit. And this is a story that includes 2 other stocks, but they're not moving as much. And this is on the back of a Bloomberg report over the weekend. Now, the market was closed yesterday. So the report over the weekend by Bloomberg suggested that Paramount's amended deal to Warner Brothers suggests that Warner Brothers might be interested in coming back to the table and discussing the terms with Paramount, and that suggests that we could see a further escalation to this bidding war between Netflix and Paramount over Warner Brothers. Vonnie, back to you.
Sure, David Zaslav is thrilled with all of this escalation. Abir, thank you so much. Abir Abu Omar there. State Street's Marvin Lowe weighing in on some of the latest economic data, then writing, quote, the market's recent reaction has been that all news is bad, creating the view that recessionary odds have increased. Our view, however, is that the economy remains on solid footing. Marvin is senior global macro strategist and joins us now. And of course, your view is much more than that, right, Marvin? Your view is that it should be risk on. It's not just that the economy is on a fine footing. So why is the market then pointing to perhaps an increased odds of recession?
Yeah, I mean, we entered the year ultimately heavy from a positioning perspective. We know how solid the markets across a number of asset classes were last year. So, overall risk had a fairly heavy weight in portfolios. And we're going through some fairly significant, questions and reshuffling with regard to winners and losers, particularly around this technology AI trade. And that's going to create volatility. If we were coming in from a much looser overall positioning perspective, we'd probably have a little bit more room. But, volatility is something that probably isn't that surprising after the year we had last year and really the last few years.
You say mega AI is starting to crowd out less robust business models. What gives you the confidence that mega AI is, the place where the business models are actually robust?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that this is just the evolution of this kind of broad, really disruptive trade and technology that's making its way into the economy. We're starting to see the fruits of that labor, the fruits of the amount of capital that's being spent. I still think that we're quite early on, and we're going to be surprised by some of the losers, and some of the winners might not necessarily be names that we know yet at this point. But it's having the impact that a lot of this investment has been pointing at towards for the last several years already.
Marvin, is it even possible to value these companies right now, to know their sort of economic value, if you like? Obviously, famously, Warren Buffett didn't get into Apple, right? Because at the early on, he couldn't value Apple properly.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth to that. The disruptive nature. Yeah, if we kind of just think about overall, communications and the internet during the early 2000s, the disruptive nature of that technology across businesses, across economy wasn't really understood, but it certainly was accretive to overall growth. It was accretive to capital spending, and now we have the fruits of that labor. I think very much discussion is similar to AI, and that's what makes it difficult, particularly given how widespread the rally has been across any name associated with AI, and that really wasn't a healthy response. There are going to be losers to these really large winners.
Can I move to the Fed, Marvin, because a lot of this volatility
Sure.
is possibly, predicated on what the Fed is going to do this year. I mean, there's so many outstanding questions, and sure, we might be talking about the difference of one rate cut or a couple of months, but it could also be something much larger than that, right? Given that we don't know who the next Fed chair is going to be. I mean, it's likely to be Kevin Warsh, but we're not fully sure how that process is going to play out.
Yeah, it's never a dull moment in our world, is it? Yeah, you know what? I view the rate cut discussion as fairly narrow. The economy is ultimately going to define just how aggressive, the Fed could be. It's still a committee that decides what monetary policy is going to be. And if the data is pushing aggressively against what the Fed is doing, we're going to see that make its way into asset values. And, for the most part, asset values are a leading indicator to where the economy is going. I think that we need to get nuanced and really think through balance sheet policy, think through communications, really think through the fact that overall bond yields have been suppressed by a very, very vocal, active, and aggressive Fed for the last 10 to 15 years. And a lot of what at least, Kevin Warsh is talking about is going back to before that period existed. And from my perspective, there's more premium that's needed in that type of environment.
So, Marvin, are we not getting the returns that we deserve for the amount of risk that we're taking then? And is the VIX not really representative at around about 21 today?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I guess I would say that we should expect the volatility to continue. Again, positioning is still quite heavy. A couple of days ago, we were still talking about being near all-time highs, despite the fact that we're worried about this volatility. So it is a rotation. and people own a lot of stocks, and they're trying to figure out which ones they want to own. When it comes to Treasury yields, I think that there is a need for a safety bid in the face of volatility. But the reasons that we didn't like yields kind of in this sub 4% level last year was that there were these concerns that were out there, and whether it's the deficit, whether it's inflation settling, above 2%, which is what we had been comfortable. None of those questions are really answered yet at this point.
No, they're not. Marvin, are you concerned at all about liquidity or anything about this market give you concern?
You know what? Liquidity certainly is always in the back of my mind, particularly when we talk about capital being pulled into AI, and really funding these business models to the size that we've seen over the course of the last 6 months to a year. Kind of having said that, my read on liquidity, which is a daily thing that we go through on the trading desk to really understand if there's stresses in the financial system, is that liquidity is still ample enough to really create at least an orderly market as we get to what is a clearer value on a lot of these business models.
You're defensive on duration, which I don't really think is the consensus right now. And partially that's because you think that Warsh's past statements on the balance sheet and also his type of communication will add volatility. Yeah. So where are you recommending people hedge? What are the good hedges right now?
Yeah, and I think that is really the key point in terms of this Treasury rally, is that all of the hedges that typically work are expensive. The Swiss franc certainly is one that one goes to in that type of environment. It is expensive. Gold, we've kind of seen what gold has done over the course of the last several quarters. It's no longer that safety hedge that we would normally expect. I'd say equal duration makes sense. I think that one needs to kind of broadly think through maybe some of the more stable aspects of the technology sector in terms of at least finding balance within that volatility, and really thinking through the Swissy, thinking through whether or not the yen has a little bit of stability. I think those conversations are still making their way kind of through the trading desks.
Well, it's just going to give us fodder to keep chatting with you over the next few months. Marvin, thank you so much for joining us today. That is Marvin Lowe of State Street. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Danaher is reportedly paying about $10 billion to buy medical technology company Masimo, which is up about 38% in trading right now. Danaher and Masimo did not immediately respond to the FT's request for comment. Goldman Sachs planning to remove the diversity criteria in identifying potential board candidates. That's according to a Wall Street Journal report. The bank's board is expected to approve changes this month, and that move in line with similar rollbacks by Wall Street peers, including Citigroup and Bank of America. Civil rights leader Jesse Jackson has died. Jackson was an acolyte of Martin Luther King Jr. and carried on King's struggle for justice and equality, running his own civil rights organizations. In 2017, Jackson disclosed he had Parkinson's disease. Jackson was 84.
So I'll be involved in those talks indirectly, and they'll be very important. We'll see what can happen. I mean, it's been typically Iran's a very tough negotiator. I think they want to make a deal. I don't think they want the consequences of not making a deal. They want to make a deal.
President Trump commenting aboard Air Force One ahead of today's talks between the U.S. and Iran, which are currently taking place. Joining us now is Mika Solner of Bloomberg Government. Mika, as I understand it, the same problems abide, right? So Israel wants certain things included. The U.S. isn't really for that, but Iran has agreed to talk about nuclear enrichment, at least if the U.S. talks about sanctions easing. Is that it?
Yes, I mean, President Trump seems pretty confident on where the talks stand right now, and we'll note that it's really interesting that he's kind of taking himself out of the picture right now. As we just heard the president say, he's indirectly involved. The nuclear talks have been led by Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and so I think that we're going to see, more to come this week. But this also comes on the heels of a President Trump meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last week, who he said these talks must continue. So we're going to see what happens this week in the continuation of these.
Moving to different theaters now, and it's not a theater, at least yet anyway. Trump talking with Xi Jinping about decisions on making weapons sales to Taiwan, or sort of removing the backlog there and getting those weapons moving to Taiwan again. Do we know any more about those discussions, Mika?
Yeah, this is going to be a huge decision that I know that the White House is, really interested in pursuing. This comes after the U.S. already provided weapons last December, and this is going to be a huge tension point between the U.S. and China as President Trump prepares to go meet Xi Jinping in April. So I think that we're going to see more ramp up on this, and of course the U.S. and there's a lot of Republican and Democratic lawmakers, really pushing for more security in Taiwan as well, and who really want to increase the presence there.
What should we be looking out for today, Mika? What's on the agenda?
Yeah, President Trump will be holding policy meetings, and I think that we're going to see more play out on the foreign policy stage as Iran takes center stage this week. So we'll likely hear more from the president and his team on that, as well as potential talks on DHS and ending the negotiations there to end this partial government shutdown.
All right, Mika, thank you so much. Mika Zollner there of Bloomberg Government. Turning to technology, the Pentagon's contract discussions with Anthropic hitting a snag after the company wants to protect Claude, its AI tool, from being used for mass surveillance and for developing weapons. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Neil Campling. So there's an ethical concern here, right, Neil? The Pentagon is a little more comfortable perhaps with just staying within legal limits, but Anthropic wants to put more guardrails in. Is that it?
Yeah, that's exactly it, Bonnie. I mean, this is bringing together two massive topics of discussion right now. Obviously, AI in the headlines every single day, as pretty much is defense, as you've just been talking about with some of the geopolitical situations. This really, I think, is all about the protection of the data. The data is the most important part of the value within the AI ecosystem. And these guardrails being talked about are to make sure that the right purposes are being used with the use of this data. So obviously the Pentagon will use it within legal limits, but they want to be able to basically analyze and use that rich data set in order to expand this relationship. And that's clearly a point of contention.
Yeah, because, Anthropic positions itself as the more responsible, perhaps more ethical AI company. But, I mean, does that mean that the Pentagon can just go with the likes of OpenAI's ChatGPT? I mean, you've Alphabet's Gemini, xAI's Grok. There are plenty of choices. Are they as advanced when it comes to this kind of technology?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know exactly how each platform stacks out in terms of the technology that can be used in a defense setting, of course, because it's very secretive in terms of that nature. But as you mentioned, there are alternatives. So there could be an opportunity for an alternative platform to be used, such as obviously Alphabet controls the entire ecosystem, including the data. That could be one option, as you mentioned. OpenAI may well be another. So this story probably has got quite some room to run and developments to look out for in the next couple of weeks, I'd say.
Neil, how close are we to, voice-controlled drone swarms that can target multiple military targets at once?
Yeah, I mean, this is again a fascinating story playing on the terminal this morning, talking about really the idea that potentially SpaceX could be the platform to choose in this. And actually, it's a good example that SpaceX technology really has evolved at breakneck speeds over recent years, and now it could be used in additional settings. So it's a great story to watch out for, especially as we get closer to that expected IPO in a few months' time.
It seems there's nothing that SpaceX won't try to do at the very least. Neil, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Neil Campling. Shares of BHP in London extending post-earnings gains. Results were boosted by an historic metals rally, and for the first time ever, copper accounted for more than half the group's profit. Bloomberg spoke with CFO Vandita Pant earlier.
For the first time, 50%, more than just about 50% of our earnings, EBITDA, came from copper, and performance across our assets has been very good. To take example of Escondida, which is our largest mine that we run in Chile, we are revising the guidance up for this year and next year, which means that we will be producing more copper in the constructive copper price environment that we are in. So very pleased with that. And not only that, across our assets, as you would know, we have a lot of byproduct in our copper segment. In our assets, in the half, almost $2 billion of byproduct revenue was booked across gold, silver, and uranium. So a fantastic business and really reliable performance coming through across all our assets, with more to come in terms of the higher guidance for Escondida, for example, that I have given, along with the outlook on medium term with the copper projects. We have 4 very attractive copper programs around the world, in Chile, in Argentina, in Australia, and in the US, which means that we will increase our copper production from where we are into the future as well.
Coming up, we'll get you set up for your shortened trading week. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Now a look at what's ahead for this week. Of course, it is a holiday shortened week, but we do have the latest Fed minutes coming on Wednesday. Plus, we get Walmart earnings on Thursday. Just a few stragglers left, of course, for earnings season. And then in terms of economic data, we're going to wrap up the week with December PCE. That's, of course, after the benign CPI last Friday. We also get PMIs and New Michigan sentiment on Friday. So a big day for economic data. Let's look at some pre-market movers. Massimo up almost 40%. This on a Financial Times report that Danaher is considering a $10 billion deal to buy Massimo. And, of course, that would massively increase the value of Massimo. It was worth about $7 billion in market cap before today. Norwegian Cruise Line on a report that Elliott Management is buying more than a 10% stake in Norwegian Cruise Line, going to try and put somebody on the board there, an ex VIP at Carnival, to try and turn things around there. Shares are trading really where they were around COVID era, even though demand has come back. And then Paramount Skydance up about 3%. Warner Brothers might actually reopen sale talks now that Paramount has really sweetened its bid. Of course, that may make Netflix reconsider its bid as well. Let's take a look at the macro environment this Tuesday after the long weekend. We have S&P futures pointed lower, NASDAQ futures pointed even lower than that. So it looks like we're going to come in on a bit of a negative note. We also have Treasuries continuing to rally with the 10-year yield down another 2+ basis points and the dollar index relatively unchanged. Let's take a look at oil as well, because we're looking at these Iran talks and seeing which way they go. Right now, New York crude up about 1%. Bitcoin holding in there around $68,000. Look at that VIX, though. It is above 22. Maybe that's a cause for concern. That is it for Bloomberg Brief. Surveillance is next. This is Bloomberg.